Crit community, welcome, 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 Crit community. When you come on in the room, come on in the room and hit share. So good to see you. So good to see you. We're coming at you with another special guest. I'm about to introduce Professor Julius Haag. But before I do, I want to remind you all, Crib community, I don't want you to miss a single episode. So don't forget to turn on your notifications in your IG settings so you can be a part of 3830 when we go live. I want you to come in the room live. But I also appreciate you watching if you can't make it. I appreciate you watching afterwards. So just wanted to give you that little reminder. So good to see you all. So good to see you all. How you doing, Julius?
I'm feeling good. You know, it's
Yeah.
8:30. I'm here. I'm up, and I'm ready to be in community and to talk and to see people, and just grateful for the opportunity.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming. So much.
My pleasure.
All right, so I'm going to start off with your bio because I have a feeling you have a lot of followers in the room. But for those folks who don't know, now you know. Here we go. All right, so Professor Julius Haag is a scholar in policing, youth justice, racialization, ethnicity, and criminalization. His ongoing criminological research agenda employs qualitative research methods to examine how young people navigate community-level violence and various forms of hyper-surveillance by both peers and the police. His research interests related to teaching and learning focus on the experiences of racialized students with post-secondary education. In particular, his research has focused on the lived experiences of young people from the Afro-Caribbean community. He also studies the growing role of social media in both promoting and intensifying real-world conflicts, and is currently involved in a collaborative study of young people's experiences with gun violence in the Greater Toronto Area. Professor Haag currently teaches courses in policing, the sociology of crime, and can I take some of these classes?
You are welcome to. You
Okay,
can come and guest in some of those classes. It'd be a pleasure to be, actually, to have you come in. So that's
all right.
Perfect.
Let's talk. I'm sorry, I interrupted. The sociology of crime and domestic radicalization and terrorism. Welcome, Crib community like nobody can. Give Professor Julius Haag a warm welcome, Crib community, warm welcome. And I see the hearts are already going up.
What's up, Crib community? Good to be here. Hope everybody is well.
I love it.
Great to be here.
Awesome.
Sociology in the house for real.
Oh yeah, representing.
Yeah.
Big
My
time.
sociologists.
Yes. Actually, that's where I started in undergrad. I went to historically Black college in the U.S., Hampton University, shout out HIU, but I was a sociology major, and really liked how it sort of positioned my perspective and rooted in sort of larger, societal contexts, right?
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah.
And that's why I share with students. Sociology gives you that toolkit, that lens to see the world no matter what you do, and it is that field that you can branch out to other academic fields, to the law, to work in different public spaces, and sociology will take you there. I was a sociology undergraduate, but I actually started off in English and composition. And about halfway through, I switched it up to sociology and criminology because my research interests changed, and I wanted to learn more about the issues we're talking about today. Actually.
Right. Wow. Okay. So similar paths. I love it. So on that same vein and understanding your pathway, I ask this of all our guests: what drew you to this work? Because it's important work, but it's also challenging work. But what drew you to this work?
It is, and that's, yeah. So I've had this interest for a long time. I can think back all the way into high school, writing papers about racism, about policing, wanting to learn more about it. And knowing that in Canada, we didn't, at the time, and I'm dating myself now, many years ago, we didn't know as much as we do today. And we still don't know enough, but we certainly didn't know enough then about these issues. We didn't have the data that disaggregated by race. And about midway through my undergraduate career, I had this very visceral experience with racial profiling at the hands of the police, where myself and some friends were detained for several hours, interrogated, fingerprinted, threatened by police officers. And I came home and you know, almost immediately after that switched into the sociology program at Waterloo where I did my undergraduate because I wanted to pursue that interest and to learn about it and to write about it and be active in those issues. And I've had subsequent experiences with the police, and that's fine. But also, you know, being in community settings and meeting young people and learning about their experiences, hearing about the injustices that they've had to deal with and go through, that's what keeps me driven, keeps me moving, keeps me trying to advance these issues, keeps me working through challenging times and issues, because I know, you know, this work has to be done. And, you know, if I can provide some small measure of impact to that work and to provide, you know, my voice where I can on these issues, I always will do that.
Yes, yes, yes. Amplifying voices for greater good. But I mean, it is so true that wherever you go, there's a high likelihood that when you see people that look like you and I, that we have been stopped, harassed, followed by the police in many forms.
Absolutely. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter your position in society, what your background is, how you get paid, whatever it is. The police, that lens they see you from, you know, it's how we look, right? That's that master status that brings the police attention to you. So it's everywhere.
I'm sorry. Can you drop that gem again? Can you?
It is the you know, this is actually one I can't claim this entirely. I cribbed this from Professor Wortley, but blackness, and Professor Owusu Bempah as well. Blackness is the master status by which the police see you in public. You know, and that transcends everything that you've done, everything that you haven't done, your education, if you were prior involved with the criminal justice system, whatever it is you may do. When you're in public space, that's the lens by which you're seen.
That's right. That's right. Wow. I want to talk about the Toronto Star article where you really sort of got into issues of structural inequity, if you will. So earlier this year, the Toronto Star released new data. Just this year, but I digress. Released new data illustrating how gun violence is concentrated in Toronto, particularly within specific intersections, blocks, housing communities, and apartment buildings. In response to this article, you stated that violence is concentrated in places that have also faced other forms of systemic structural disadvantage, a lack of sustained investment in community programs and initiatives. And these also tend to be the neighborhoods that suffer the most from aggressive policing. So I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about the correlation, particularly its root causes, its consequences, and maybe perhaps let's explore solutions.
Absolutely. So, you know, when that data came out, I was interested to see the data. I'm glad the data is there. I think that's important data that we need to have in the Canadian context so we can start thinking about our own solutions and we can start looking at our own problems really critically. And, you know, what it comes to, this is part of a historic pattern of disinvestment in these communities that stretches back decades in Ontario. It's about the decline of supports for the community-based services and programs that young people rely on. It's about dilapidated public housing stock. It's about a lack of access to public transit. You know, anybody who's waited for a 36 up at Jane and Finch knows exactly what I'm talking about, trying to get around. And, you know, these are the neighborhoods that violence has historically been concentrated in. And when we see these issues happening, you know, these are the issues that disproportionately we have put police funding towards instead of sustained investments in community programs. So the time I've spent, you know, working in community settings around organizations doing good work, you know, many organizations work without a safety net. They don't work without sustained funding commitments. They work on contingent or temporary funding. They are competing with each other for scant dollars. When we spend over $1 billion a year alone in Toronto policing. And what we're disproportionately investing in there is addressing these issues through the criminal justice system, which have far-reaching negative impacts for young people, their families, and communities that follow them through the life course, instead of meaningful funding for prevention at the community level. And that really comes from building up the complex social supports that people need in their lives, whether it's employment supports, whether it's educational supports, mental health and wellness, whether it's, you know, I need a clean shirt for an interview, I need a ride, you know, to this site, I need access to work boots, you know, I need a place to be that's safe after school so I can work on my homework, I need mentorship. these are the things that we have not historically invested in. And even when we have community violence prevention funding, you know, there was a recent round of this funding that came out, an analysis by Claire Wilmot, somebody that I know academically. There was $200 million given out for community support funding between 2019 and 2020. Only 1.6 million of that went to city services, and the rest went to police agencies.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So when we talk about funding, you know, we have funding for police initiatives over the summer to crack down on guns and gangs, but we don't have money to open community centers.
That's right. That's right.
And we don't have money to that. Pardon me. Yeah, go ahead.
No, really. No, drop, listen, drop the knowledge. Keep going.
And, you know, I'm struck by being in these settings and, you know, seeing people out here doing good work, doing work that's at times dangerous, work that is traumatic, that's tiring, that takes out people. And do they get compensated in the same way that we compensate our police officers? Heck no, they don't.
Okay, so many gems for community, so many gems. So this is not an anomaly that's unique to Canada as well. In the US, working with Safe Streets, every single year, these are individuals that put their lives on the line to intervene before violence occurs. They are the interrupters. And every single year they are fighting tooth and nail to maintain their doors, make sure their doors are open. And while we increase budgets for, you know, more policing, security systems in schools, so forth and so on. But the other gem that you brought up is that the individuals who are doing boots on the ground work that are from the community, doing work for community, are also essential workers. And they're not included as such. They're essential to our survival. Yeah, I feel that.
And it's a 24/7 job, you know, being out there and people, you know, getting calls in the middle of the night, you know, this is happening, I need supports, you know, struggling and striving, trying to work with complex funding arrangements to make it work, to put, you know, square pegs in round holes sometimes when it comes to finding ways to make sure that young people get the supports they need. Because also when we look at a lot of these programs, and I'm not trying to diminish the good that's being done by funding into community spaces, but a lot of that funding is a top-down funding. It doesn't come from, you know, a building with community around what those needs are. So I see a lot of people working very hard to make these things work on the ground, and my utmost respect to them for the work they do. So much of that goes not acknowledged. And we just saw recently that, you know, 2 young people who are community workers here in the GTA, you know, lost their lives to violence, young people that we failed. Yeah. And that tragedy, it just breaks me inside to hear about that.
It's interesting when you mention the top down. First of all, yes, acknowledging the recent murders that have occurred with our young people in the GTA. But I think it's interesting when you mention this top down and the fact that I think that it is so. I lost my train of thought, but it really misses the mark on so many levels, for lack of a better word, more direct word. It misses the mark in terms of where resources go. And I feel like, that's the word I wanted to say, that it's this constant look for a quick fix, right? Ken Hardy talks about this whole idea of when racism coupled with, you know, coupled with violence and victimization, we stay in this sort of panacea of just seeing and go to doing. Okay, something happened, now I got to do it and fix it, and not in the being, which requires us to look at the structures that have contributed to this. Right?
And we are moving from tragedy to tragedy sometimes. And, you know, we see spikes in concern about this around critical events. I think all the way back to Summer of the Gun, Year of the Gun, 2005, and how that has cascaded through young people, through families, through communities. You know, now all these years later, that is still such a lens that we see how we have structured interventions in communities around these critical events, that, you know, when those critical events transcend the racial and spatial boundaries of where we think violence should be concentrated, when the victims don't fit into that category of who we think are deserving victims, that's when we see that spike in public attention and concern. But is it sustained? It's not. It's not sustained.
I'm just not even, you heard what he said, Kirk Committee. You're picking up what he's putting down, Kirk Committee, right? Okay, I'm gonna go on the next question because that just got me. Woo! All right, so in a 2020 report, the Ontario Human Rights Commission found that Black people are more likely than others to be arrested, charged, or have force used against them during interactions with Toronto police. Similar reports have since come out about Peel Police. Now that we have official data, what are some next steps for researchers and policymakers to address this issue?
There's so many things that need to be done. I think many of the things that need to be done are things that community members, activists, academics, concerned parties have been calling for these things for decades now. So now we have this data. There needs to be, on the policing end of things, there are actionable policy directives in terms of sustained data collection. That's not just a one-time shot data collection. That's reporting that tracks individual officers for their behaviors, for their interactions, tracking the intersections of race with our criminal justice system, not just in policing, but at all stages of the criminal justice system, monitoring individual officers for accountability, discipline, and dismissal, if necessary, for not complying. We've seen recently that Peel has entered into a memorandum of understanding with the Human Rights Commission for legally binding mechanisms to track and have accountability. We see other things, improving anti-bias training, improving de-escalation training, having alternative frontline first responders that are not police responding to these situations, you know, having increasing diversity in the police force. You know, many of these things have been sent around and there's a limited body of evidentiary support for them. I think the broader issue that we're looking at here is trying to scale back the intensity of police surveillance in our communities, because what we also learned from this report is that racial profiling and discretionary stops at the hand of the police, these are the sites of these interactions. These are the contributory events that can spiral into violence. So if we want to reduce the scope and intensity of violence against our communities, we need to reduce the scope and intensity of policing. And that comes from a commitment to transferring our focus from funding to the police, to the extent it is now, to reinvesting in our communities and in our young people. Right? So this is not to say that there's going to be a switch we flip tomorrow where there's going to be no police in our communities and we can completely defund the police and there'll never be no need for the police. But there are certainly things, and police will tell you that themselves, there are certainly things that they do, there are duties that they do that are not well suited to what they do. And we know that there are pressing needs for funding, sustained funding commitments to evidence-based approaches to prevent violence, to prevent disorder before they become policing issues.
And
so there's a host of things.
Thank you for providing clarity around defund the police. Thank you for providing clarity around that definition. And the fact that, you know, police are contacting you, police are contacting me for solutions to addressing the issue. And so there's a real recognition by some of the fact that they can't do it. They weren't even trained. They're not trained to do it. But that's we can go back to that historical context as well.
Because
but if that's the case, then why not distribute funds widely to those people that are already doing the labor of love for our
it's that disinvestment we've mentioned earlier that you're exactly right. And it's the disinvestment that we've mentioned earlier that has prioritized police responding to all social problems in areas where other services either don't exist or those services have been defunded. And Crib Community is in the chat right now saying more accountability as well for police boards, for officers. We need to have accountability and transparency when it comes to investigations of police misconduct. We need to see, if we are to accept the outcomes of these investigations, we need to see the process by which they're enacted. And we don't have that historically. And it makes it impossible for us to develop that relationship, you know, with the policing institution without it being a site of accountability.
I mean, okay, wait for it. I mean, can we just get some vibes? I mean, come on with it. Yes. Next question. In your research, you discovered the link between social media and youth violence. Can you talk a bit more about some of your findings as it relates to young people's experiences with gun violence in Toronto And then also, how are social media platforms hindering and helping Black youth's ability to cope with trauma as a result of these violent experiences?
So absolutely. So in terms of the relationship to gun violence, it's still something I'm exploring. And I think many of the findings that I'm coming across here evidence some scholarship we see in the US. So that social media is a sort of virtual staging ground for young people who may be having real world conflicts. Some of those conflicts can be mediated and resolved in the online space. Young people engage in taunting, people get dissed. There are conflicts on social media. That's nothing new, right? Social media is just the new place where it's happening, right? But at times, those conflicts, if not mediated, if not resolved online, to progress to real world violence, right? And part of the problem is with the always on nature of social media is that we have young people traveling to communities that they might have problems with, the rival communities. They're showing up in those communities. They're challenging, in probably platforms like this or platforms like TikTok, I'm in your neighborhood, I'm in your community, you're not here. They're challenging the control that people claim to have over their own neighborhood, and that can potentially lead to real world violence. Part of the problem that comes from this as well is that when you have these sort of always on nature of social media, if it does progress to violence, there's the potential that that violence can be more lethal because people have the ability to discern where somebody is. If something's going to happen, I know where people are at, I know where they're not. In those events, potentially that can contribute to more serious forms of violence. Now, I think that there is a very real role here, though, for social media as being a site for young people to get out some of those problems and to deal with them in a nonviolent way that, 10, 15 years ago would have been a physical confrontation between people. So I think that there is a role here to be played for social media. In terms of the aspect of trauma, I think that there are a number of harms associated with social media. We know from research on social media and its impact on trauma that exposure to Black death, to Black violence on social media can contribute to, vicarious feelings of anxiety, of trauma, of PTSD-like symptoms. They can contribute to depression. They can contribute to a space where young people feel that they have to always be on, that they can't let their guard down, that they can't show weakness. And it would make it difficult for some people to, reach out and find supports that they need to, access the types of resources they need to get support. At the same time, I think, particularly in the context of the pandemic, social media in the online space can also be a platform where people can reach out and find those supports, where they can be in community, where they can share their cultural expressions with other people, they can connect to people in their networks. And, in that second life, I can think it have a very positive point as well. And there really is, also some harms associated that potentially that social media is another site of surveillance for the police, right? So there's a potential here as well that young people may restrict how they express themselves online because they're worried about police looking over their shoulder and not being able to interpret what they're doing online and trying to use that type of behavior online as a means to criminalize them.
Yeah. Ooh, you said a lot there. You said a lot.
I did. I apologize.
And I loved it. No, don't apologize for these gems.
It's just too much coming out.
Here at the Crib Community, we do some truth telling. We have candid conversations. So just lay it all out there. I love it. I mean, this is the space where you can feel free. So I love it. Thank you very much. One of the things that, though, I want to pick up on is this, the viewing of Black death. And I've heard it from, and you mentioned the complexity, the pros and cons to it. For example, the disproportionate reality of Black people experiencing the murder and the annihilation of is nothing new, right? But in the middle of multiple pandemics, the world was able to bear witness to our chronic pain, our repeat exposure to such atrocity. And so I was recently on a podcast where I said, I'm not interested in going back to normal. Everybody's like, oh my God, I can't wait to go back. I want you to still be watching. I want you to still understand and be exposed to on some level of what we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis that we carry as we go to the grocery store, as we tell our children, be safe as they go to school. So there's that part of it. I'm thinking about, my colleague and friend Desmond Upton Patton's work about this expression of grief over social media platforms and providing.
Shout out Desmond Patton.
Yeah, Desmond's, he's so dope. providing a pathway as well. So it's interesting, the pros and cons of it all, for sure.
And what, Professor Patton talks about in his work is, this can also be a space that people who are trying to reach young people where they're at, youth outreach workers, people working in community settings, this can potentially be a site to reach people in complex spaces, particularly in trying times like this.
Yeah.
So I think there's a benefit here. And I think that you're entirely right that, this has opened a door to the world to seeing a reality that they can't turn away from, right? And when I'm asked by people, what's going to happen with this movement for Black lives, what's going to happen now in the future that we've had this upswing of support, about these issues and, calls for, radical transformations of our social arrangements around these issues, I don't think we can close that door, and I don't want to close that door. And I think that social media plays a very important role in keeping that conversation live.
Leave the door open. Yes, yes, and yes. So just while I was reading just some of your articles and just in preparation for our time together tonight, I was thinking about, in particular, my model of coping for African American survivors of homicide victims. And with that model, I sort of unpack and I talk a lot about the culture of homicide in particular, that once someone experiences the homicide level, they enter into a culture where there are certain sort of norms or beliefs or values or what have you, that describe their experiences of surviving family members and friends of murdered victims. And part of that includes feelings of shame, blame, stigmatization, and a sense of a lack of justice, particularly if a murder occurs and police take a long time to respond, the murder goes unsolved, or there is an assumption that it was gang and drug related, et cetera, et cetera. I want to focus on that part, that lack of justice part, because I think there's some intersection between how we come at this. What is the impact of the chronic experiences of injustice on the public health and well-being of Black folk?
It is absolutely a key determinant of the health and well-being of Black folks. And, Akwatu Kenti has written about this extensively. And, his work, I think, is really guiding us in Canada, looking at this lens from a public health perspective, that, the impacts of negative encounters with the police, the impacts of witnessing those encounters have broad impacts. Living in a neighborhood that's characterized by aggressive policing, a neighborhood that, young people face violence, in their communities, sometimes on a daily basis, can contribute to serious negative mental health impacts. It can contribute to diminished feelings of citizenship and belonging. It can contribute to distrust of other social institutions.
Yes.
It can lead to, talking to young people in my own work, I don't feel safe leaving my block, my neighborhood.
Right.
I stay on the balcony. I don't go downstairs.
Right.
I don't go here. I don't go there because I'm worried about the police officer stopping me.
Right.
It can lead to feelings of, anytime I go out, I'm afraid to hop in the TTC because I feel like the TTC cop is looking at me. I can't go to Shoppers Drug Mart. Those types of impacts, they cascade through individuals and through communities and families and intergenerationally as well. Because we know it's not just direct experiences, it's vicarious experiences as well. And we know that those vicarious experiences are shared, far and extensively in the community. So you don't even have to have that direct contact with the criminal justice system, the police, to assume, how you're going to be treated. You mentioned the talk earlier on. We know it's a very real thing that we have to transmit, how to comport yourself in those interactions and what to expect, right? And that contributes, the Ontario Human Rights Commission used this phrase that it compromises our future, that racism compromises our future. And, I think that's a gem right there, because it really does. And I tell to my students that, what you might think is an isolated issue, the over-surveillance of Black communities, Black youth, has impacts that cascade throughout our society, right? And we should all be deeply concerned with these experiences and with these interactions, right? Because they served in many ways for people who have been stigmatized by this, that we're robbed of their contributions culturally, socially, to the fabric of our public life. And we share public life together. And in that manner, I think that the impacts, can't be understated.
Wow. Oh, wow. Racism compromises our future. I know we're at the 9 o'clock hour, but I hear you, production. I hear you. We're at the 9 o'clock hour, but wow. Okay. And I would be remiss if I didn't, you're bringing up the fact that so many times, at least in my work, when I talk about homicide, many people are thinking about the homicide that happened on that city block in that particular neighborhood over there. And they do not understand that if we are to intervene in terms of the fact that racism does compromise our future, Black future, because it's so much more than that city block, particularly within the Canadian context. If you think about African, Caribbean, and Black folk who are experiencing homicide and gun violence in Toronto, but also experiencing it in Jamaica, South Africa, Uganda, Nigeria, so forth and so on. And so this worldwide impact of grief, of trauma, is far greater than just that neighborhood city block. In addition to that, we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility as service providers, as researchers, as medical residents, to train them on how to understand the complexity of what's going on. That racism and homicide and gun violence and policing surveillance are all traumas that Black people experience. You may be sewing up that bullet wound or operating on a person, but understand the complexity of the traumas that they're coming at you in the hospital room with.
Absolutely.
So much of that.
Racism is not a factor to be controlled for in our research. It's not a variable in our research. It is a fundamental lens by which we must view the social world for racialized people, for Black people in this world.
Come on. Come on.
Racism that is the essence of systemic racism. And anytime that I hear it described as anything less, I have to ask very serious questions about what people are talking about.
That part. Crip community. Crip, did I not promise you some things season 3? Did I not? You got hearts. Did I not promise you some things for season 3? Woo-hoo! Oh my gosh. Oh, wow. The last question. I forgot about the last question. I'm just enjoying talking to you so much.
I'm loving it
so much. Let's keep this going.
Thank you, Crip community.
Yeah, let's keep this going even when we get off the line. But the last question that we ask of all our guests is the title of this season of 3830 is Interdisciplinary Scholarship in Action. How might working across disciplines advance policies addressing the over-policing and surveillance of Black communities?
I think that we absolutely, as interdisciplinary scholars, need to continue having these broad and frank discussions about these issues and recognizing many of the things that we've talked about before, that the roots of over-policing and systemic racism are historical. They're part of the fabric of Canadian society. From the inception of the Canadian project, that racism is part and parcel to the colonial project that is Canada. It is visible in the violence against Black people that's perpetrated every day, and that is perpetrated as part of a broader climate of systemic racism that disadvantages and criminalizes Black youth at every turn, from lower graduation rates, disproportionate levels of school discipline, inadequate social supports, lack of adequate housing, transit, lower status jobs, higher rates of preventable health disease, conditions. What I mentioned earlier, diminished feelings of citizenship and belonging. So, if we view it from that lens, racism as a public health issue, it is impossible, I think, for me to visualize any kind of fulsome, meaningful conversations about these issues that don't encompass a variety of different academic backgrounds and disciplines, all brought together by the need to improve the life outcomes of Black youth, Black families, and Black communities, not just now, but in generations to come. So if we want to have these conversations, not a crim thing, it's not a sociology thing, it's not a political science thing, it is an interdisciplinary thing that recognizes that these are complex social and structural issues that require complex solutions.
Great community, mic drop. You come on with it. Yes, and yes, and yes. On that note, crib community, it is 6 minutes past the hour, and I really could continue this conversation all night. And so I Thank you. The Crib community thanks you for joining us this evening. I mean,
I appreciate it. Thank you, Crib community. Thank you,
seriously.
Tanya. You know, this is very meaningful to be in a community and be in space. I'm feeling isolated like everybody else, and to come together and have these conversations means a lot.
Well, anytime, anytime.
Yes.
And I mean that on IG and off. Seriously.
Yeah,
Seriously.
100%. We're still in touch.
So as always, from our crib to yours, Crib community, stay safe and keep well. Good night.
Yes. Bye, buddy.